Hi guys, welcome to Memo's tutorials. We are continuing with ecology. On our previous lesson, we last looked at food chains, where we say that they show feeding relationships between organisms in an ecosystem. So now we want to move on to food webs. These food webs are more realistic. They show us that an organism might actually feed on more than one organism. For example, when we look at a food chain, it's just a single chain that shows A eating B, B eating C, C eating D. But then when we move on to a food web, A can be eaten by 3 other organisms, B can be eaten by 4 other organisms or 2 other organisms. So a food web is much more realistic. But what you need to know is that every food chain, it doesn't matter even if it's a food web, it will begin with a producer. So here a food web is just a group of interlinked food chains. It's a group of interlinked food chains. We have a very good example there where we are having our cabbage as our producer. Remember, every food chain starts with a producer. We are having our cabbage being eaten by a man being eaten by a lion, and a lion being eaten by a vulture. But that same cabbage can actually be eaten by a rabbit. A rabbit can be eaten by a man eaten by a lion, then a vulture. Or another chain being a cabbage being eaten by a rabbit being eaten by a lion, and a lion being eaten by a vulture. The last chain is for a cabbage, rabbit, then a vulture. Okay. So food webs, like I said, they are more realistic. They are close to what is happening in ecosystems, right? So now let's say they ask you a question to differentiate between a food chain and a food web. So you're just going to tell us that a food chain, it has got only one sequence of feeding relationships. It's just one. But when you look at a food web, it's not one, it's actually several interlinked sequences of feeding relationships. It's quite a lot. It's a lot of food chains combined together. And then when you look at a food chain, each organism occupies only one trophic level. Your plant is your producer. The second organism, that will be your primary consumer. The third, it's your secondary consumer. The fourth is your tertiary consumer. But then, when we look at a food web, each organism may actually occupy more than one trophic level, except for producer. So the producer is the only one that remains constant, but then the others can actually differ from one food chain to the other. I'll give you an example of this food from that food web there. On top, we've got cabbage being eaten by a man being eaten by a lion, then a lion being eaten by a vulture. On that one, a man is our primary consumer, right? A man is our primary consumer because he fed on cabbage. But then on the other one, where we are having cabbage, a rabbit, man, lion, and vulture. So our man now becomes a secondary consumer because he fed on a rabbit. Okay. I'm sure you can see now what we mean when we say one organism may actually occupy more than one trophic level. But then you must know that the only trophic level other organisms cannot occupy is the one for being a producer, right? And then the food chains usually involves fewer organisms than a food web. We don't have a lot of organisms in a food chain compared to a food web. So a food web has quite a lot of organisms, okay? So with that being said, now we are moving on to ecological pyramids. So these are just diagrams. It's actually diagrammatic ways of showing feeding relationships in an ecosystem. So the ecological pyramids are made up of a pile of rectangular blocks on top of each other. And we have got 3 types of ecological pyramids. We have got a pyramid of numbers, we've got pyramids of biomass, and pyramids of energy. So we'll start off by looking at the pyramid of numbers on this lesson. Then the other remaining two are going to have a look at them on our next lesson. Okay. So the pyramid of numbers, just like the name itself, we are going to be focusing on the number of organisms on each trophic level, right? On each trophic level. Remember, the first level is producers, followed by primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So in this case, the length of each rectangular block actually shows us the number of the organisms in that particular trophic level, right? So the longer it is, it means that we have got more organisms in that particular trophic level. The smaller or the shorter it is, it's a sign that we've got less organisms in that particular trophic level. So we have a very good example here where we are having 5 producers, 10 primary consumers, 150 secondary consumers, and 5 tertiary consumers. So they just made the blocks smaller for producers because they have a smaller number of 5. Primary consumers is 10, you double that. Secondary consumers is 150. So there are as many as possible. The rectangular block had to be very long to show that it's quite a lot of organisms at that particular level. And then at the tertiary consumers, we are also having a lot of tertiary consumers, right? So these pyramids of numbers are not always upright. They may also be inverted. So this simply means that we might actually have more tertiary consumers, more secondary consumers, more primary consumers. In other cases, it can be vice versa, not like the way it is here, right? We can have small number of organisms at any trophic level. So it would depend with the number of organisms whether it is inverted or